Okay, so again, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 9, page 1083 in Eitz Chaim. So we just read about Passover, and now we move on to the Omer period. You count off 7 weeks from Passover. Start when the sickle is first put to the standing grain, and you will observe after 7 weeks Chag HaShavuot. The word Shavuot simply means weeks, right? So the holiday of weeks, or as we sometimes call it, Shavuos, right? Using the Ashkenazic pronunciation. And it does not say very much about it. You should observe the Feast of Weeks for the Lord your God, offering your free will contribution according as the Lord your God has blessed you. Okay, so the idea here is as much as you want. You're coming to Jerusalem, it's a pilgrimage festival, and bring whatever offering you want to bring. God's blessed you with more, bring more. And there's a kind of dual system throughout the Torah in terms of how people bring things to the sanctuary or the temple or the Mishkan, whatever it is. One is a system of voluntary donations, like this. And this was the case also when the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was constructed in the wilderness, this first temple or later synagogue. And there's a building campaign. And whoever wants to contribute to the building campaign, the language of the Torah with respect to the Mishkan, as their heart moves them, right? They give. But then there are other things, which are, for example, tithes, right? So there's a tithe for the poor, 10%. That's it. You don't get to give 8. It's not necessary to give 15, 10%. So we have these two, you could actually see them as, in some ways, forms of taxation, right? That the people are required to give, and free will donations. We see that in synagogues today in a certain way. We have dues, right? Which are regular required contributions. And then we have often campaigns, high holiday campaigns, things like that, where people give what they give. But here it's not to the synagogue, it is to God. And it's also to the priests who serve God. And on that holiday, so you bring it, this is at the end of that spring harvest. You've been blessed, you have your bounty, and you bring your bounty, at least some of it, to Jerusalem, where you will celebrate. And you rejoice there with your son, your daughter, your male and female slave, the Levite in your community, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in your midst at the place that God will choose. And then it says, remember, you were slaves. There is no injunction more common in the book of Deuteronomy than remember you were slaves. Hey, you were slaves. Remember that you were slaves. You're going to go sacrifice. Remember that you were slaves again and again. Here, I think the context suggests, remember how little you had, right? Remember your terrible state. Be grateful to God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You're no longer slaves. And now look at all you've had, all you've received, and bring to God some portion of it out of gratitude for your current state. Of course, elsewhere we get the idea, remember that you were slaves, because you should. We just saw this after concern for the father, the widowless, orphans, poor people, etc. And I think there the sense is also empathize. You know what it's like. And so open your heart to those who are deprived and care for them just as God cared for you. Okay, and now we come to the third holiday, number 3 of 3. And that is the holiday of Sukkot. At the ingathering from your threshing floor and your vat. This is the end of the final harvest of the year. We all know it takes place in the fall. This is when everything is gathered in, all the produce that is going to last you through the coming winter. Then you should hold the Feast of Booths for 7 days, Hag HaSukkot. So what is this booth business or sukkah, right? So elsewhere, we see this idea that we dwell in Sukkot because God caused us to dwell in Sukkot when God brought us out of Egypt. In other words, these were the wilderness structures in which the people lived. And we are therefore reenacting the experience of the wilderness. That's what we're doing. And that is one possibility. And that would give this a historical connection. Each of the pilgrimage festivals has both an agricultural connection and some kind of historical connection to the life of the Israelites, of the early Jewish people. So here, and we see this elsewhere, it's about the period of the wilderness. I want to go back for a minute to say, when we looked at Shavuot, this count 7 weeks and then go celebrate, it's the only one where we don't have a historical connection, right? At all, it just says, bring your produce and celebrate. So the rabbis are concerned about this. There's a lack of symmetry, and they calculate and come to the conclusion based on the times in the Torah that Shavuot was the time of the giving of the Torah. That on Mount Sinai, God comes down and gives Moses to transmit to the people the Torah on Shavuot. Right? It's not in the Torah. Doesn't say it, makes no mention of it. That's a rabbinic idea. And the idea is that this is the time when a covenant is formed with the whole Jewish people. And more than that, in the rabbinic imagination, and since Shavuot is coming up, I want to dwell on this for a second. This is the time of the marriage of the Jewish people to God. So up on Mount Sinai, God takes us to be God's people. And we actually receive our ketubah, our wedding document, and that ketubah is the Torah itself. I yesterday recorded a podcast, which will come out just after Shavuot, in which my podcast partner and I, who is an Episcopal priest, talked about Shavuot and Pentecost, which is the festival that Christians have 7 weeks after Easter. And he talked about, it was interesting to me because he talked about it as God creating a relationship with the community of the faithful. And it's the way in which the church, the original church, is born. And I was just struck by that similarity between that and the idea that God and the Jewish people here create their relationship. Be that as it may, though we don't have in the Torah itself a connection with Shavuot, we certainly have it with Sukkot. The rabbis are of two minds about Sukkot and what the sukkah was. One idea was that, well, first of all, what is it in the Torah itself? Before we get to the historical connection, what is the agricultural connection, since each of these is an agricultural festival? And some people have suggested that actually when people went out to do the harvest, they had these structures that they would build to provide them with shade during the period of harvesting. From the historical perspective, we have this idea that somehow these were the booths that we lived in, the structures we lived in the wilderness. There is a problem with that explanation, though, because we have no evidence of it. Nowhere in the Torah does it actually say that they did. Now, you could just say, okay, the Torah doesn't say lots of things. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. But in the Talmud, the rabbis have a dispute over this. And the other opinion is that when they talk about Sukkot, what they're really talking about is this cloud of glory, which covers the Israelite camp during the day. There's a fire at night. There's clouds during the day, and as a palpable expression of God's presence. Take your pick. doesn't really matter. There's no reference here also to one of the other major mitzvot, which is to take branches, the lulav, the etrog, and wave them together. At any rate, it says, "You shall rejoice in your festival, and then you, your son, your daughter, your male and female slave, the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, hold a festival for 7 days in the place that the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless all your crops and your undertakings, and you will have nothing but joy." Very strong statement. V'hayita af sameach. You will be totally joyous, right? So all the festivals are supposed to be joy and bring joy. This is all about rejoicing in the gifts that we have. But Sukkot is the joyous festival. And we do that, we mention that liturgically in our prayers, right? We call Pesach, right? The holiday of redemption, right? We call Sukkot, it was Shavuot, Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah. And here, what do we call Sukkot? Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. So it's supposed to be the most joyous holiday of the year. It's at the end of the year. You've gotten your bounty. It's all good. And now go and celebrate. And I want to mention the fact, joy is commanded, right? It's commanded. There is a life without joy is not a life that follows the Torah. You can punctiliously do every commandment. You're not following the Torah unless you rejoice. And to me, that's a very, very powerful idea. In some ways, you could say that since God has given us these gifts and blessings, not enjoying them and appreciating them is an affront to God. God wants us to enjoy. God wants us to live lives of joy. And just to make sure we do, we have these festive occasions during the year. Okay. And by the way, there's another connection here. So much so that Shiva, according to rabbinic tradition, is not observed during the festival. Right? If someone dies, whatever Shiva you observe gets cut off with the festival, you're done. Even if it's, someone is buried the day before Sukkot, you get 1 day of Shiva, then that's what you get. Joy trumps sadness. And if it happens during the holiday, it's in the middle of Sukkot, then Shiva gets postponed to after Sukkot. And I think it's very hard for a mourner who just lost someone they love not to be joyous. I mean, to be joyous. But there's another part of Shiva, of course, and that's also the community and their ability to celebrate. And so the obligation to come and to console mourners is deferred or canceled during Shiva. But I also want to say that doesn't mean you can't go, right? If someone's had a loss and you want to just drop in, that's okay. You just don't have an obligation to do that. Whereas in the Torah, the idea of consoling mourners is a mitzvah, right? There is some obligation to do it. The other thing I'll mention about this is that, sometimes people wonder, should I pay a shiva call? I didn't know the person so well. Is it appropriate? From the point of view of the Jewish tradition, it's always appropriate. Go. Your presence is what counts, because when you go, you're showing somebody that you care about them, that you matter. And in some ways, even if you're distant, look, even this person who's distant came, I matter. So if you're in doubt, go. Okay, we finished the holidays, so I will open things up for a moment. And if there are questions, Barry, go ahead.
So these celebrations are very much focused on an agrarian society.
Yes.
But even at that time, not everyone was a farmer. There were also shepherds.
Right. But
remember, how is that, these obligations interpreted
in terms of shepherds, they too have their harvests, right? And they bring their flocks and they are slaughtered and they enjoy the benefits of that and rejoice in it. The more complicated question is when this is, first when they're in the land of Israel, okay, but we're also going to have other people. People will have other jobs, and particularly when they settle in cities, they'll have other jobs, right? So the idea then of tithing, for example, becomes, your income, right? And that you take the money that you have and you go to the place that God has chosen, and you purchase there the wherewithal to have this feast. But it is assuming an agrarian economy, and therefore it really talks in those terms. Other questions, comments? Yeah, Saul.
Yeah, going back to Parshat Emor in terms of Sukkot. All right, I noticed there the Peri Eitz Hadar Kapot Timari Ba'anaf Eitz Savot V'Arvei Nachal. They don't mention anything about the etrog.
Oh, so Pri Eitz Hadar is understood, right? The fruit of a beautiful tree, the Pri is a fruit, right? Okay. But you're right that it doesn't say an etrog there. And the rabbis have all kinds of theories about, well, what fruit is it? What is a nice tree that you would, and so the way the rabbis read it, at least the interpretation that wins out, why is this the fruit? I think they translate a goodly tree or something like that, because it has both flavor and aroma. But it's not clear. Whereas the other branches, to a certain extent, are made more explicit. And again, we don't have it here, but it's clear that it is. One has to read these various accounts of the holidays, and we have several, including the one in Emor as well. You have to read them together. I don't think it would be reasonable to say, well, in Deuteronomy, they're telling us it's only a harvest festival. We only dwell in Sukkot, and we don't have lulav and etrog. Right? We read it all together. So you're quite right to ask about that. Anything else about holidays? Or okay.
Question.
Sure.
Well, two things actually. You say that Shavuot is the only joyous festival. What about Hanukkah? I know it's not a major holiday, but it's still a festival.
Okay, so two things. Okay, the first is I didn't say it was the only joyous festival, It tells about other
Okay.
festivals too, that you should rejoice. But this is the most joyous festival.
Got it.
And then Hanukkah is not in the same category.
I
It's
know.
not it yes, and the other thing about Hanukkah, it's not in the same category. It's not in the Torah, right? It's post-biblical. So there are not the same kind of concerns or laws at all. You go to work on Hanukkah, to give you one obvious example,
Or, yeah.
right? So, which is not to say you're not happy on Hanukkah, but there's no commandment to be happy on Hanukkah, though we
Got
do
it.
take joy in it, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay, good.
And the other
And-
thing was really quick. There is, I thought it was in Ecclesiastes, but I don't remember. But to your point about the importance of joy, somewhere it's written, man shall be called to account for every permitted pleasure he fails to enjoy. It's somewhere. I don't
Yes.
remember where. I remember reading it.
So it's not, it is in the Jerusalem Talmud, right?
Okay.
And the idea is, and it's very similar to what I had said, right? The idea is that we will have to account to God for every legitimate pleasure of the world that we did not enjoy. So
Right. It's
this,
like,
right.
go
So
ahead.
we're supposed to enjoy life,
Yes.
but at the same time, let's emphasize that with each of these holidays, we get told again and again about the poor, the widow, the orphan, etc., that our rejoicing is not complete, right? We're not truly rejoicing when we're rejoicing alone. That we really, the joy comes in part from including others and looking out for those who are unable to care for themselves. Okay.
I always thought about it as social responsibility too, that's part of it.
Yep. Okay. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Let's move on to the next parsha, Shoftim. Very, very short passage, which is tremendously packed. So we get now a command to establish judges. This is one of the major, we're going to look at in Deuteronomy. Here we talk about judges. We're going to next talk about kings and the people having the right to establish a king. Since God is the king, then how could we do that? So we see that. And then we're going to see also warfare. We'll see a whole host of different ancient institutions. Here we're talking about Shoftim v'Shotrim, right? It says magistrates and officials. Shoftim are judges, right? So a judicial structure. You should appoint. That is the people. It's not clear how they do it. Maybe the elders do it. We don't have a sense necessarily that this is democracy. We don't have judges running for election, but we do have this sense that it's not God. God is not, choosing, as God chose Moses, right? God chooses prophets, but these are people. They're ordinary people who have, with the consent of their peers, been put in these positions, in the settlements that God will give you, and they will govern the people, mishpat tzedek, which is translated here as due justice. Mishpat are laws, right? And tzedek means justice, just, fair, equal, legitimate, all of those things. And just as an aside, of course, the word tzedek, meaning justice, is at the root of the word tzedakah, which we often translate as charity, right? And I think it's important to notice that, because when we think about the word charity, we think of sort of an overflowing of our heart, that we feel bad for those who don't have enough, that we're struck emotionally, and therefore we want to give to them. That's not the Jewish notion of tzedakah. Tzedakah is justice. That is to say, charity on this giving that we do is actually an entitlement. The poor are entitled to it. We have an obligation to create a just society. And part of a just society means that nobody starves, right? Everybody is taken care of. And rather than say, oh, I feel bad, isn't it terrible that so-and-so has such and such? Okay, so, and then we get this injunction for these judges, lo titeh mishpat, you judge fairly, show no partiality. You should not. So what does it mean to show no partiality? What it means is that you shouldn't, look at a wealthy and powerful person and, be a little bit intimidated and feel that you're kind of, you're looking towards them in a favorable way, or the opposite. That if you have a wealthy litigant and a poor litigant, you don't say, well, that guy's so rich, if I decide in favor of the poor guy, what does he lose anyway? Whereas the poor person really needs it. So you can't do that. You can't show partiality, and you can't take bribes, right? So what are bribes? The word is shochad in Hebrew. It is a gift with some expectation attached to it. So you can't take gifts. A judge can't take gifts because there is, on the part of the giver, some expectation that that person will look favorably on me. Even though the judge could easily say to themselves, I just judge on the merits. They give me gifts, sure, very nice, but I'll still decide against them. I'm not, justice is blind. I don't see it. Well, the idea here is that it has a pernicious effect. You can't help but be disposed positively towards someone who has given you something. By the way, I mean, this case, right, can also be made in terms of politicians and people who receive a great deal of money from, vested interests. It's hard then to say, well, you just, they've contributed tremendous amount of money to my campaign. But of course, when I make my decisions, I don't consider that at all. The Torah here, at least with respect to judges, is saying, no, that's not really possible. It's human nature that when someone gives you gifts and you're in a position of making decisions, that you will be influenced by those gifts. Because what does it do? It blinds the eyes of the discerning. It sort of casts something over the way you see things. Right? You don't see things as clearly, and it upsets the plea of the just. Right? So it brings things out of balance, and then we get this resounding statement. One of the great statements, I think, in the Torah, if you had to, find a phrase that just rings, this is it. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you should pursue. So let's unpack justice, justice. One way of looking at it, of course, is that it's just emphatic. It's repeated for emphasis. Justice, justice you should pursue, right? That there's a demand. There also is a way of reading it, do just using just means, right? You have this idea, it's the outcome that matters. You see this, to use a contemporary example, what if someone didn't receive a Miranda warning, right? They had the right to consult a lawyer, and they weren't told that they had that right. And now the court throws out the case, even though the person is guilty. It seems clear the person is guilty, right? Here we're being told, if you read it this way, justice has to be pursued through a just method. There are rules. You have to follow the rules. Otherwise, it's not just, even if the outcome is just. So it's a purity of means and it's a purity of ends. And now I want to look at the last word. So tzedek, justice, justice, and this idea of pursuing, right? It doesn't say justice you should do. Pursuit is an active process. You're going after it, right? You're not just, well, it would be good to live in a just society, and I will, when it comes to me to make decisions, I'll make sure they're just. You've got to be actively working for justice. And then there's another aspect of pursuit, which means if you continuously pursue, you never catch it, right? You're always pursuing. And I think that's important because perfect justice, you could argue, is unattainable. You can never know all of the circumstances, right? You're judging a case, the evidence is presented, you have to make the best decision based on the evidence you're given, right? You do your best. You're constantly trying to get as close to justice as you possibly can. But there's a sense in which only God is just. Only God sees it all. Only God knows it all. So we can't simply say, well, I don't know. We can't know. You have to do everything that you can to know. You have to pursue justice. But you have to acknowledge that justice will sometimes be imperfect. And if you do that, then we're told several times throughout this, if you do this, if you do that, then you will thrive and occupy. You'll have a just society. The Torah is trying to envision here a kind of ideal society. We saw that with the laws of the sabbatical year, right, which we just studied, where the debts are canceled in the 7th year, where land reverts to its original owners every 50 years. This idea of trying to create this almost utopian society in which everything that could possibly be done to care for the poor, to be fair, to be just, is what's trying to be created. And it doesn't necessarily work out that way, but the Torah is presenting us with a kind of ideal. Okay, now we're going to shift to a little bit of ritual law, and we're being told that you shouldn't set up a sacred post, asherah b'kol eitz, of any tree, literally, any kind of pole, but the word here is eitz, is a tree, and you shouldn't do it, or a pole, eitzel mizbeach, next to the eitzel mizbeach Adonai. You shouldn't put that sacred tree or pole next to God's altar that you will make, right? So this is clearly a pagan practice. You're not supposed to do it. I want to suggest two things. Oh, and then lo takim lecha matzeva, you shouldn't put up a stone pillar, which is a matzeva, which God detests. So the thing about this pillar is very good Jews used to do it. And to give you the classic example of that, I want to go all the way back to Genesis, to Jacob, who puts his head down in the wilderness, has this dream of the ladder going to heaven and the angels coming up and down. And then it says, Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is present in this place, and I didn't know it. How awesome in this place. It's none other than the abode of God, the gateway of heaven. Early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had placed under his head and set it up as a matzevah. Right? Exactly what Deuteronomy is saying you can't do. And he poured oil on it. And he has a sacrifice there, right? So the altar, the matzevah, some kind of ritual act. So this is clearly a widespread practice in the ancient world. Deuteronomy is not condemning Jacob, but it's saying new rules now, because you're going to live among these pagans, and therefore this practice which your ancestors did, you're not allowed to do it. Because we don't want confusion between their God and our God, although sacrifice is still sacrifice. That's not forbidden. In fact, that's commanded. Okay, so now we move on within this sacrificial section. You should not sacrifice to your Lord, the Lord your God, an ox, a sheep that has any defect of a serious kind. And we just read that. Moses tends to be repetitive. I think part of this is just emphasis. Since we're talking about what you can and can't do, I already told you that, but here we're in the context of setting up sacred pillars, so on. Remember about no blemished animals. Oh, one more thing about the stone pillar, about the matzeva. The word makes its way into modern Hebrew. You know what a matzeva is? A matzeva. It's a gravestone. Right? It's a matzeva. So this idea of an erect pillar is taken and transformed in later Hebrew to the stone you erect on it. Right? I don't know if you have, you don't have a headstone, still a matzeva. I just don't know in modern Hebrew, but be that as it may. And now we're coming up to what you do with an idolater. How are you to treat an idolater? We already saw some laws about idolatry. Someone who claims to be a prophet and tries to convince people to abandon the worship of God. Someone who tries to entice members of their family, and even a city, the whole city, which has gone over to idol worship. Here we're getting very specific about a particular person who decides to worship idols. If there is found among you in one of your settlements, the Lord your God is giving you a man or a woman who has affronted the Lord your God, transgressed his covenant, turning to the worship of other gods and bowing down to them, to the sun or moon or any of the heavenly hosts, something I never commanded, right? So this I never commanded is emphatic here. Not only did they do it, but I didn't command it. And why? Because you could make an argument. Oh, I worship the God of Israel, but I'm also allowed to worship these other gods. God says, no, I never commanded. No, I never said you could do it. Right? So the sun, the moon, and the heavenly host, by the way, I'll say it again, I've said it several times through this class, non-Israelites are perfectly allowed to worship those things. That's the view of Deuteronomy. It's only the people of Israel who has a specific covenantal relationship with God who it's demanded that their relationship is exclusively with the God who brought them out of Egypt. Now, you have been informed about this idolater, and you've learned of it, and you've made a thorough inquiry. So this suggests that you have to have a judicial process, a process of fact-finding. You're going to have a court. Somebody's going to come to the court. They're going to say so-and-so was worshiping the moon. And you're going to look into it, and you're going to come to a conclusion. So the rabbis, when they look at this in the Talmud, see an opportunity here. Let me go further, because you'll see a little of it in the text itself. You've been informed, learned of it, make a thorough inquiry, and if it's true, and the fact is established that that an abhorrent thing was perpetuated in Israel, you'll take the man or woman who did that wicked thing out of the public place, you'll stone them, man or woman, to death. A person shall be put to death only on the testimony of 2 or more witnesses, must not be put to death on the testimony of a single witness. And that, you have to do a very thorough examination. You need witnesses and a minimum of 2. Right? So already in the Torah, what's required in a capital case, and this is a capital case, right, is a very thorough judicial procedure in which witnesses come forth and they say, yeah, I saw that guy worshiping the moon. And there have to be 2 of them. And if not, you have no case. The rabbis in the Talmud go much, much further in terms of this judicial procedure. They really don't like capital punishment. And there become all kinds of qualifications for the witnesses, for what the witnesses have to have seen. And we get later on this statement that a court that finds one person guilty of an offense in 7 years has blood on their hands. And then we have the remarkable statement by Hillel, a court that finds someone guilty of a capital offense once in 50 years has blood on their hands. So the requirement, the standard here in the rabbinic world is extraordinarily high. Guilty beyond any doubt, not beyond some shadow of a doubt, is beyond any doubt, without any question. And so much so, and the rules of evidence become so strict that it seems virtually impossible to convict someone of a capital crime. So the punishment here is stoning. And from the point of view of the Bible, that seems, how else are you going to kill someone? They don't have guns, but you're in the wilderness, you have lots of stones. The rabbis, too, are concerned about this. They're concerned about the whole process. They say, well, actually, you know what stoning is? There's a place, you build this structure, you take a person very high up and you drop them on their head. It's not people throwing stones. And the idea is that death should be instantaneous, right? Because imagine being stoned to death. I mean, it's going to take a while. You're going to suffer. The idea here is they shouldn't suffer, even though they're not even doing it. This is kind of a fantasy almost, because it's clear the rabbis are not carrying out capital punishment. First of all, they don't really want to, but the other thing is that they're under the rule of Rome, who wouldn't let them do it anyway. But so they have this kind of fantasy, and you take them up to this tower, and if that doesn't work, 2 very strong men come and drop a stone on his head. And only if that doesn't work, then people start to throw stones at him. And by the way, if a person, according to this rabbinic analysis, a person is he's been found guilty, he is on his way to execution, suddenly new evidence comes up, they got to drag him back to court. The whole thing has to be heard again. Okay. So you need 2 witnesses. The hands of the witnesses are the first against him to put him to death, right? They have to own this, the actual bloody consequences of their act. They have to own, and then the rest of the people afterwards, and you will sweep out the evil from your midst. So the assumption here is that idolatry is extraordinarily contagious. Idolatry is a cancer. If it's not cut out, it will spread. There is an enormous fear. Deuteronomy is shot through with this fear of the potency of paganism. That once the people come into this land which was the land of the pagans, they're surrounded by it. It's so alluring that it must be excised. And we see that here. We're going to move on to look next time now at situations where courts can't decide. They're having difficulty applying the law. They don't exactly know what to do. We'll see that next time because there's a lot to be said about it. So what I'm going to do now is open it up once again for questions that anyone might have. Marilyn, go ahead, and then Sandy. Marilyn, you are muted. Still muted. Maybe I can unmute. Yeah, there you are.
Okay. The Torah says, thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. Did
Right.
it work?
Did it work? Apparently not. Because there is, if you look in the Torah itself, beyond the Torah, now we're in the time of the prophets, for example, people are constantly sliding into idolatry. Doesn't work. It is a snare that they keep getting caught up in. So it's a struggle. They forget. They worship idols.
And what are the repercussions?
Well, so the repercussions are that, when the people don't punish, God punishes, and punishes the people as a whole for failing to do what's necessary to do. But yeah, idolatry does not disappear. Remember that according to many modern scholars, this book was actually found much later. It was found during the reign of King Josiah, who looked around and saw all this idolatry, and immediately there was this religious reformation. So it shows you that in Josiah's time, until these reforms, idolatry was alive and well. We know about King Solomon, and this is going to become relevant soon, next time, when we look at the laws of kings. King Solomon married all these women. He married so many women, and he brought them to Jerusalem to be with him. And they had, each one of them had their own palace, and they were allowed, Solomon's wives were allowed to worship alien gods in Jerusalem. And it seems like he went there with them, not to worship. When it's like an interfaith couple where the husband, he goes with his wife to church. He's not there to pray. He's Jewish. He's not tempted even, but we're family. We do these things. So it does not disappear, and it becomes a kind of ongoing struggle to keep in the prophetic period. You have two things that we saw in Deuteronomy, which Moses is warning against, which just don't get eradicated. And one of them is mistreatment of the poor, and the other is idolatry. Okay, Sandy, you had a question.
Yes. So, Rabbi, you say that the Jews should not are forbidden from worshiping idols, but the other people are allowed to. So how does that fit in with the law of the 7 laws of Noah, where it says do not worship idols, meaning for everybody?
No, they have to acknowledge God. They can have other stuff. They have to acknowledge God as God. but they don't have that primary relationship. So, and by the way, that idea of the 7 laws of Noah, right, is all a rabbinic invention. It's not here at all. The book of Deuteronomy is the one who says, God gave them these other things that they can worship. The rabbis are the ones who begin to list the things that they are allowed to do and not allowed to do. So in some ways it's unfair, just as it's unfair in some ways to read this text in terms of how the idolater is to be punished, in light of, to read back into it all of the rabbinic legislation, which seems to virtually outlaw capital punishment. In Deuteronomy, they're not outlawing. They have certain procedures, but the expectation in Deuteronomy is that they will execute people. So I think, it's interesting to see how it develops into the rabbinic period. But in Deuteronomy, they're allowed to worship these things. And there does not seem to be a sense that they have to acknowledge our God. They're allowed to worship the gods that they worship. One more thing I forgot to mention. No sacred trees next to the altar. But actually, in the Mishkan and in the temple, there is a sacred tree. You know what it is? It's the menorah. The menorah, if you read the description of the menorah, and it has branches and it has flowers, symbolically, it is a sacred tree. But it's authorized, it's not worshipped, it's viewed as it's a lamp, right? It's not really a tree. But it's interesting that it becomes a kind of evolution of this ancient idea of the sacred tree, which winds up exactly near the altar. Other questions, comments, Barry?
This is Rabbi Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe,
Yes,
has a gravesite. His gravesite is in Queens near Kennedy
Right.
Airport,
right.
and that it's a place where many people go to worship and to
Yes.
pray.
Yes. So they go, in fairness,
So I'm getting back to that prohibition against sacred stones. In
uh,
some sense,
so
his
yeah,
gravesite is
I
worship.
will say a couple of things. First of all, it's not just a stone, right? It's a kind of tent. They call it the Rebbe's Ohel, right? The Rebbe's, it's a structure. Now, in fairness, Chabad has really raised, Rabbi Schneerson after his death to this messianic figure, this almost godlike figure. And that's very problematic. But the idea of going to the grave of a righteous person and praying there is a well-established and ancient Jewish practice. Jews to this day go to the cave of the Machpelah in Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebecca, but not Rachel, are buried. And they go there and they pray at these graves. Other tombs, there is a custom of doing this, a widespread custom, particularly among Sephardic Jews of a certain kind. So I don't want to suggest that this is idolatrous, because it's a very traditional practice. But I would suggest that some of the way that some of the Chabad Hasidim, and I want to say some and some, look at Schneerson as this messianic figure who will come again, sounds a lot like another religion where the person who is viewed as the Messiah died and is said to come again. And that's extremely problematic. But not all Chabadniks believe that. And, I don't want to paint with a very broad brush something which doesn't need to be. Anything else before we wind up? Okay, So we are continuing next week as we've extended the class, and we'll keep going into June. It's a pleasure to see you all and to teach you today. And I want to wish you, if I don't see you, a wonderful Shavuot, which is coming up next week. And I'll see you after that, and enjoy this really beautiful day. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thank